Hey everyone, welcome to the ETSki YouTube channel, ETSki Tutorials. So there's one question that I get asked all the time, like sometimes almost every single day. And that question is, how did you teach yourself how to make video games, or how did you learn how to make video games? So I'm going to make a detailed video going from the very beginning of where I started and all the way up to where I am now and the steps in between and kind of the general thought process of how I did learn all of those things. So yeah, that's what this video is going to be. Alright, so this video is probably going to be a little bit long and contain a lot of information. So if you want to jump around, I'm going to put annotations on the screen over there, or you can just scroll to that part in the video. So before I get too much farther into this video, I just want to mention that we are almost on our last week of the Kickstarter, and as of right now, we are 76% the way there, and that is just amazing. Almost 100 people have backed this project, which is just mind-blowing, and thank you everyone so much. So we only have one more week, we are almost there, so if anybody is interested in the Ultimate Game Dev Tutorial Series, a giant tutorial series teaching how to create a 3D adventure video game, both programming and art, all from the ground up. Links in the description below to that Kickstarter page. So yes, let's jump right back into the rest of this video. So I started making games when I was about 13, and basically making video games is something that I've always wondered, like, where do video games come from? How do you make video games? So when I was 13, I kind of learned what Google is, and I started Googling around how to make video games, and one of the things I found in the Google search was GameMaker. So GameMaker is actually a pretty sweet program. It's still available today, and a lot of developers actually still do use it to make 2D games, and it is something that I would still recommend. So basically the first thing that I did when I opened up GameMaker was I loaded up their example projects and I just took them apart and I just figured out how they worked, or at least to the best of my ability at the time. One of the examples it came with was some little airplane game, and I would just do little tweaks to it, like, oh, if I change this number, the plane moves faster. If I do this, then this does this. If I take apart this, then this breaks and the game gives me errors, and just a bunch of things like that. And I just kind of got a very vague idea of kind of the basic construct of how to put a game together. So once I vaguely sort of had an idea of how to make a video game, I opened up a new project and I started making a video game myself. So with this game, there was really bright, flashing neon colors, and it was super obnoxious to look at. And you were like this little spaceship that would move around, and it was kind of like a puzzle platformer, except I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So when I started trying to put together a platformer, there's just tons of glitches. Like once you press the arrow keys, the player starts moving. When you let go of the arrow keys, it just keeps on moving. And then there was stuff like if you were to jump and hit a wall, you would stick to that wall and then you could jump again, and just a bunch of really weird glitches like that. So actually what I ended up doing was I designed all of the level design around all of these glitches, and I kind of pretended that all of these glitches were actual game mechanics that I thought of, when in reality I just couldn't figure out how to get any of that stuff to work. And going through and making that game, there was just so many points where I would stop and go, wait, what do I do next? Or how do I take apart this? Or how do I create this? How do I do this little function? And most of the answers that I got from that actually came from the GameMaker documentation. I believe it was just called the help file. But basically it was like a big instruction manual for GameMaker. And towards the end, I pretty much have read that thing cover to cover. So I guess that would be my first piece of advice. Even back then, it was actually still relevant to me. But whatever engine you're using or whatever tools you're using, have the official documentation open and ready for reference so you can quickly go back and forth, because as you're learning, you're going to need to reference that like every other minute. So yeah, I pretty much finished up that first game that was full of glitches, but I pretended like there actually weren't any glitches in there, and it actually ended up being kind of fun. Back then, I really didn't share my games with anybody outside of, just my friends and family and stuff like that. So I never really put it on the internet or anything, which is kind of sad because I really wish I had those files now. But yeah, so I created that game and it was kind of fun. So then it was time to move on to my next project. So if I remember right, I think my next project was a platformer shooter stick figure game or something along those lines. And it was still full of a lot of glitches, but it was a little bit better than the game I made previously. I ended up spending a lot more time taking apart and really analyzing the platformer example that came with GameMaker. And once I had a little bit of a better idea of what mistakes I made and how to fix those mistakes, I started working on this game. And pretty much it was the exact same process again. Every single time I got stuck, which was, every other minute, I referenced the documentation and I basically just kept on doing that and just keep on going back and referencing the examples and figuring out how they did a little something so that I could figure out how they did that and then put it into my own game. And I eventually created like the first level or something, and I had plans to kind of keep on going. But it ended up just being like really messy, super laggy because I was on like a Windows XP super old computer. And then, yeah, I guess I kind of got bored with that project or gave up on it or something. So after the first level, which was actually a pretty long level if I remember right, I don't know, I was pretty happy with the project, but I decided that I want to start over and do something new. And I don't really remember exactly what I created next. It might have been a shoot 'em up, or it might have been another platformer. It might have been a top-down shooter because I did a Halo fan game based on the book Halo: The First Strike, top-down shooter that was also inspired by the actual Xbox Halo game. And then I made a top-down shooter, which I have a little bit of footage. I'll throw it up on the screen now. I think I called it Ends of Sorrow or something along those lines. And then I made a Star Wars fan shoot 'em up, and then I made like some other shoot 'em up. But yeah, basically I kind of just kept on creating games, and just whenever I got bored with a project, I would start a new project, and I don't know, the cycle just kept on going on, and I ended up creating a lot of games in GameMaker. Some of them I would finish, some of them I would give up on halfway through. But yeah, I never really shared them on the internet, and I really only shared them with my friends. So that kind of results in the fact that I have a lot of files lost, and I was just barely able to get my most recent game, Ends of Sorrow, actually working, and I got a little bit of screen recording of that. But yeah, it wasn't until maybe my fourth or fifth game that I actually even started referencing the internet and Google searching the forums for GameMaker at the time. So yeah, most of the knowledge that I got just came from picking apart the examples that came with GameMaker and then just referencing the whatever guide it was, the help file that had all of the information in it. So basically the reoccurring pattern when it came to GameMaker was that I would just kind of pick apart the examples, learn a little something new, and then take what I learned and then think to myself, what could I create? And I'll kind of come up with a little idea and think, I think I know how I would make that. And then I would attempt it and I would start building it. And of course, many times during the project, I would find a bunch of things that I didn't know. And then I would do research on the things that I didn't know. First, I would check out the documentation, and then I would go to Google and start Google searching in the forums. So I used GameMaker on and off throughout middle school and high school. So that was about grade 7 to about grade 12. So let's see, that is 5 years of working on GameMaker just on and off. So it did take me a really long time to learn everything that I used to know back then about GameMaker. So that is pretty much what I would do every single day when I got home from school. But while I was still in school, I still wanted to make video games. So I ended up teaching myself how to create text-based games right on my TI-83 calculator. So the story behind that is basically one day when I was a kid, I was waiting in the dentist office. I believe I was in 8th grade, so I must have been about 14. Waiting in the dentist office, and for reading material, I brought the TI-83 calculator manual with me, and that book is about like that thick. It was a super thick manual, and I found the section about programming, and it was probably, I don't know, 5 pages or so. It really wasn't that much, and I ended up reading all of it while waiting in the dentist. And I remember on the car ride home, I started creating my first text-based game prototypes. So the first game I created on the calculator, I think I remember it being a text-based RPG kind of type game. But what I ended up learning from that game was that the only part that people actually enjoyed was the actual like reading the dialogue and making decisions, because my RPG elements of the game were pretty simple, and it ended up just being really simple just to create basically trees of different branches of choices that you can make in different parts of the story where it will lead you. So what I ended up doing was creating a series of games called Jiminy Crickass, and I was a little middle schooler with a very perverted sense of humor, just like all of my friends. We used to think that poop jokes and sex jokes were super funny. So I made an entire game basically based off of that, just about the hero Jiminy Crickass and his son Scooter, and then you play like the prequel, and then you talk to the ghost of your unborn son Scooter, and like all these like perverted like Michael Jackson jokes and just all the other things that we thought were really funny as middle schoolers. So yeah, in that case, I basically just figured out that, making decisions in a story is what people found fun and was very easy for me to do. So I based an entire game off of that. And then I also created a blackjack game, a text-based blackjack game with RPG elements. So that was pretty fun. But that really didn't like hit with the rest of my classmates. Like, I was really the only one that ever played it, and I was the creator of that game. The Jiminy Crickass games are the only ones that my friends would actually share, because like with the TI-83 calculators, you had this little cord that you could transfer files between, and everybody had one of those cords. So everybody, like, it just kind of spread throughout the school, and not everybody, but a lot of people actually were playing this game. And I would talk to some students, and like they were like, "Hey, have you played Jiminy Crickass?" And I was like, I made Jiminy Crickass, so that was a really cool feeling back then. Oh, one side note I just want to mention about high school and programming and making games in high school. I did actually try taking a programming class where we would learn Visual Basic, and that teacher was a horrible, mean person and was a bad teacher, and I ended up dropping out of that class because I just couldn't get along with the teacher and I wasn't learning anything. And every single time I tried to be creative and create something on my own that I actually thought was pretty cool, I would get in trouble for it, for not staying on task, and I got a detention multiple times for making games on my computer. So I just want to state for the record that the only thing that I ever got for making games in high school was a detention. So yeah, hopefully whoever you are, hopefully you have a better programming class in your high school, because mine was horrible. So that pretty much brings us to the end of high school for me, and at the time I was 18, and that age I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and what career I wanted to start pursuing. And at the time I thought it was going to be photography. Like, I still really like photography and all of that, but I ended up making the choice that, I don't think photography would be a good career. So yeah, I was really lost and I didn't know what to do. And one of my friends just said, like, why don't you pursue video games? Like, you were actually really good at making video games. And I started thinking about it and all of the games that I made, and I kind of realized, I was like, wow, that actually is a lot of video games that I have made, and it's probably one of the things that I am best at. So and then I did a little bit of research about the video game industry, and I read about how it's bigger than the movie industry. So I basically thought, like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a video game designer. And I like made the choice before I figured out how you become a video game developer as a career. So the first step I took towards learning how to make video games was I took some classes at my local community college, because they had a new video game program, or media arts or something along those lines. So I took 2 classes. I took video game culture and I think intro to video game development, which in retrospect was really more along the lines of intro to 3D modeling. So I got to learn a little bit of 3ds Max. I ended up making like a cool, like, old cathedral church castle looking thing. So that was my proud moment in that class. And then the video game culture class was a lot of fun, but mostly every single day the whole class would just nerd out and talk about World of Warcraft, so I really didn't learn that much about making video games from that class. And at that point I had already gone through the majority of all of the video game classes that they offered. I think they offered like 4 in total. So I kind of eventually realized that I needed to move on and do something else. So at this point, I had just a very quick introduction to 3D modeling under my belt. And then after doing a little bit of researching, I found Unity. And I decided that I wanted to make a game in Unity. And I saw that there was an iPhone version of Unity. And my thought process back then was iPhone games have really low poly graphics, and everything's a lot simpler because it's mobile and it fits in your pocket, so there's like lower expectations. So that is a really good place to start to make a hit game. And I was totally wrong. That is not at all what the mobile market is like. But yeah, I ended up pursuing it, and I created a game called Galaxia Interface for the iPhone, and that game just completely fell on its face. I actually ended up spending 15 months working on that game, teaching myself Unity the whole way. Basically, it was just a really big learning experience for Unity. Pretty much what I started off doing was I took the Tornado Twins tutorials, that Worminator tutorial series, and I watched that and I learned what I could from that. Then I started branching out into other tutorials and then just reading forums and just kind of messing around until I figured out everything, which took me about 15 months. And then I created all of the artwork with Photoshop and Wings 3D. And yeah, I created my first really sloppy iPhone game with Unity 3D, and I sold it for $1, and I was just hoping to make my money back because at the time Unity iPhone version cost $300. Now it's free, but it cost $300, and I also spent $100 on the Apple Store license, and my goal was to just make my money back. And I couldn't even do that, so it just completely fell on its face. But that's okay, because it was a really big learning experience. So in case you are catching on to the pattern of how this works, step one, when you're introducing yourself to a new video game engine, is to just take something apart or get a quick reference from something and just kind of get a basic understanding and create something with what you think you know how to do. And then along the way, you're going to find out there's a lot of other things you need to learn too. And then when you get done with that, you start a new project and you think to yourself, okay, what can I create with what I know now? And at the time, I actually ended up starting to do a first-person shooter because I started doing tutorials on YouTube because I saw other tutorials and I wanted to share what I knew, and I thought that I would be able to explain it pretty good. So I started making tutorials, and then I asked everyone, what kind of tutorials would you like to see? And everybody across the board said first-person shooter, first-person shooter. So I started making a first-person shooter. I created a prototype in like 2 weeks. It was like really, really rough and very, very basic. But yeah, I just started creating tutorials and teaching how I created it. And then every tutorial, I would add a new feature and add a new feature and add a new feature. And then eventually it kind of turned into almost a full first-person shooter engine. So I decided to slop some graphics on there, and then I came up with Robot Zombies. So on a side note, I don't think everybody has to create tutorials in order to learn how to create something, but I can definitely say teaching other people what you already know is an excellent way to learn more yourself, because you'll either learn new things while you're trying to explain how to teach things to other people, or you're just going to solidify in your brain exactly how something works, and then you just kind of learn that way as well. So learning by teaching is actually a very powerful thing. So after Robot Zombies, the cycle just kind of continued. Once I was finished with that game, I thought in my head, okay, what do I know that I know how to do, and what can I create with that? And I just kind of kept on making games. I did a lot of game jam games, which I highly recommend, especially after you get over that first like hump of, I think I sort of know what I'm doing, at least enough to create a little something. Like once you get to that point, do game jams, and those are just really awesome because you are forced into a really short amount of time, and it really forces your brain to really slap something together, which sounds like a bad thing, but it's really actually a good thing for learning new things and coming up with new ideas. So yeah, I think game jams are an excellent way to learn, but you also need to have your side projects that take a longer amount of time and you spend more time on. So I think having a mix of game jam games and games that you work on for a long time, and games that you work on solo where you do both the art and programming, and games that you work on with other programmers or artists and learn how to work with other people. Just branching out and doing as many different things as possible as soon as you get over that first initial hump where you're introducing yourself to the engine. And like as soon as you get to a point where you think you know enough of what's going on to create a little something and you kind of have a basic idea of how things work, from there just start branching out and creating as many things as you can. So I really think that the first mistake that I actually have seen a lot of people do is first they think of an idea and then they try to figure out how they're going to make that. Like they just think like, oh, I want to make a first person survival shooter, or I want to create, just whatever game. Like they come up with a game because they can imagine what they want that game to be. But in reality, you should be going backwards. You should start with, what do I think that I know how to do, and what can I make with that? Like that's the question that you really got to keep asking yourself and designing your ideas around that, because it's a lot easier to push forward when your building blocks are building blocks that you already have, and then you can start finding tools and ideas and learning things that you need to learn to fill in the gaps between your building blocks, as opposed to coming up with an idea and not having any building blocks at all to start off with. So I guess in the end, my advice would be always have the documentation and reference open and constantly be checking that. Watch or read a lot of tutorials, whether or not you actually follow along step by step, which I think is a good thing, especially when you're first starting. But if you don't have time to follow along step by step, just watching or reading a tutorial is still really helpful and you'll learn a lot of things. Next, when coming up with ideas of what kind of game you want to create, think about what you think that you already know, because I can guarantee you'll get halfway through your project, not even halfway, you'll get like 5% of the way into your project, and then you'll realize that you have some things that you need to learn, and then you'll move another 5%, and then you're going to have a lot of other things that you need to learn, and you're going to be doing a lot of Google searching. And then if you have a somewhat simple idea, or an idea of you sort of vaguely think you know how to create, or just something that you really need to add into your game but you have no idea how to create it, the best thing to do is to take it and just write down on a piece of paper step by step every single tiny little detail of how that little system works. Like if it's just something as simple as picking up a health pack and the extra health goes towards your shields, or something along those lines. You can just think of those ideas really simply, but you really need to write down step by step on paper what the variables are going to do, what numbers are going where, like what things are you going to keep track of, the health, the shields, the amount of health that the health pack gives, and write down every single detail. And if you look at a sentence and you think there might be more parts to that sentence of how everything's going to work, cross out that sentence and write 5 more sentences to break that down into even smaller steps. And as soon as you break, something as simple as pick up the health pack down to about 20 or so steps, then you have a pretty good outline as to where to start programming it. Then I guess my side piece of advice would be learn by teaching. So either create some tutorials and teach people what you think that you already know, or maybe go on the forums and try to answer as many people's questions as you can, which is also really, really good practice, because every once in a while you'll come across a post of somebody asking a question and you'll half know the answer, and then you'll need to do a little bit of Google searching and researching or testing out, and then you'll know that person's answer, and then you can help them out. So then you're helping the community and making friends, and also you're not stressing out your brain, you're exercising your brain in order to learn more things in order to help that other person out. And then the last piece of advice that I want to point out is always have fun with what you're doing. If you're not having fun, start over and create something new, because video games are meant to be fun. So if you're not having fun while you're making them, then the game's not going to be fun. So that kind of also goes for textbooks and some online tutorials or information resources. If what you're learning is just super boring, switch to something else. Like if you're reading a textbook that's just super bland, and it's just listing out all the functions and and none of it makes sense, and you have to keep on referencing things all around the book, and you don't get around to anything fun inside of that programming book, my advice would be put that book down and come back to it later if you really think that it's necessary, but at least in the meantime, start off with a different resource that is just more fun. Alright, so I think that just about summarizes all of the advice and information that I wanted to give in this video. So if you have any more questions, let me know in the comments below, and I will try to answer them for you in the comments below. So thank you for watching this video. I hope that it was helpful, and until my next video, I will see you later, and keep making games.